Okay, thanks, James.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks very much for the invitation to be here. I think the slot was booked as 3 hours. I just wanted to reassure colleagues that I'm not intending a sort of Fidel Castro-style discussion on the future of research policy. I'll talk for sort of 35 minutes or so, and then we can obviously have a discussion. As Carol says, feel free to fire in with questions as we go along. What I'm going to try and do is offer some thoughts and some frame around what are considerable uncertainties in the current climate over the future shape, design, operation of the research system, of which I'm sure all of you are aware, and just to offer my interpretation for what it's worth of where things stand, what we do know, what we don't know, and the kind of sequence and timing of likely events and developments over the coming months which should bring some clarity to the current areas that are more murky as we look at the system. So that's the object of my talk, and I suppose it's worth just prefacing it by reminding ourselves that in research policy, as distinct from wider HE policy, where there's been a lot of change obviously in recent years, the introduction of fees, etc. In research policy and research funding, we've actually had a remarkably stable system for now, the best part of 30 years. The last significant white paper in this area in terms of changing the design, the architecture of the research system was back in 1993 when William Waldegrave, you see here, was doubling up as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in John Major's government, and also was acting then as the Minister for Science, and he oversaw the production of this white paper, Realising Our Potential, which was a really good white paper and actually set the foundations for the sustained investment that we then saw in the research base through the Blair-Brown government that followed. So although there were further significant policy announcements, the 10-year framework, they broadly followed the structures and the system that was laid out back in 93. And so what we've got now in the green paper that came out in November at the end of last year is potentially the biggest disruption or change, for good or for bad, in the system that we've seen for at least a generation. And the green paper, of course, as we know, was expected in terms of its focus on the teaching side of the system. It was very obvious from noises that the Tories were making towards the end of the last coalition government, particularly things that David Willetts was saying, and also indeed from the Conservative manifesto, which made an explicit commitment to take a fresh look at the teaching side of the system and essentially introduce something like the TEF. So we were expecting that in the green paper. What was less expected was the degree of combined change that was being proposed across both teaching and research, which means that cumulatively we're looking at a period of considerable change. And so just to remind us sort of where we're at following the green paper. Green paper came out beginning of November. Then that was followed fairly quickly on the 25th of November with the spending review. And in the lead up to the spending review, there was lots of concern in the research community, the science community particularly, that there would be a tough settlement, that we'd see either an extension of the flat cash arrangement that we'd had for the preceding 5 years, or even we could have some kind of cut. In those terms, it was good news. The budget was protected for a further 5 years, and instead of being protected with no allowance for inflation, there was an inbuilt uplift in the budget in cash terms to bring us up from £4.7 billion, which is the size of the public research budget at the moment, to an anticipated budget of 5.1 or so towards the end of the spending review period, 5.2. So that was good news, although there's quite a lot of uncertainty in the detail around that, as I'll say in a minute. We then had, also around the same time as the spending review, the publication of the Nurse Review, which had been commissioned under the last part of the coalition government to look at the future of the research councils. And Paul Nurse, as you'll be aware, tried to tread a rather delicate line in both calling for the preservation of the system, the 7 research councils, in the way that we know it, but also advocating the introduction of a new super council, a kind of top layer of governance in the system, which would be called Research UK. Of course, we already have RC UK. This would be RUK, but unlike RC UK, which is more of a sort of wraparound, it doesn't have much of a doesn't have much muscle to it in terms of decision making, and certainly in terms of budgets. RUK would be much more of a strategic decision making tier. It would be able to make long-term decisions, priorities, and sort of drive those through the system. Many saw this as a potentially positive thing in terms of enabling the system to be more coordinated. Others saw and still see clear dangers in centralising, concentrating governance in the system at that new level, which takes it yet further away from the actual communities of research that the budget is there to support. And we can talk a bit more about that later. And then finally, in this kind of succession of announcements, we've had, just before Christmas, the announcement that to balance Paul Nurse's look at the research councils, one strand of the dual support funding system that we have, we'd also have now a deep look at the future of the REF, led by Paul Nurse's counterpart down the street in Carlton House Terrace, the president of the British Academy, Nick Stern. So that review has now got underway in the new year, and indeed the call for evidence for that review is open at the moment. So a lot of activity, and if one takes a sort of at face value the kinds of proposals that are in the Green Paper, the proposals that are in Nurse, we don't know yet obviously what Nick Stern is going to say. As I say, you're looking at potentially quite a lot of change all at once. Why are they doing this is a question that it's not unreasonable to ask, because on most measures the UK has a very high-performing research system, certainly in terms of conventional bibliometric measurements. Ministers will trot out at all opportunities statistics that show we have the most productive research system, even more than the US, in terms of papers per pound spent. We produce 16% of the world's highly cited academic papers, etc., etc. And the REF, indeed, REF2021, demonstrated the depth and breadth of high-quality, excellent research through the system. So whereas on the teaching side, we can obviously have a debate about the pros and cons of the TEF as a mechanism for dealing with it, but I think the impetus that lay behind their desire to look at teaching was at least understandable through the system. I mean, it's a recognisable issue. Is there an imbalance in terms of the focus on teaching and research through the system? Should something be done about that? On the research side, it was far less clear what's the problem to which all of this enormous effort of policy innovation is directed. And insofar as we have an answer to that, it is this, that there's a feeling that the system has become too complicated, which is an interesting argument. I'm told on more than one reliable authority that some bright spark in BIS, the Department for Business Innovation and Skills, decided to put this diagram on the very top of the briefing pack that was given to Joe Johnson on the very first day he took over as Minister for Universities and Science. This is in fact a diagram that was produced by someone in BIS, now no longer there, but now was the Director of Strategy in BIS, and it's intended to be a sort of map of the innovation and knowledge system in this country. I have to say, as someone who works on this stuff myself, I struggle to make much. I mean, it's a very, very complicated visualisation of the system. But anyway, clearly this, among other things, sort of seared onto Joe Johnston's brain the idea that we had created a system of absurd Byzantine complexity through which he was going to sort of, cut a sort of scythe of rationalisation and simplification. And I think also there'd clearly been, and continue to be, sufficient grumbles from within the academic community about things like the REF and the tyranny of the REF. And I mean, I've written about this, the sort of the way the REF gets described in sort of commentary, you really would think it was akin to Stalin's Gulag, the kind of agony it causes. And of course, this stuff filters up to politicians, to ministers, and certainly led to some of the sentiments that Johnston expressed early on in his time as minister about the REF. Even the TEF was introduced with the promise that whatever this thing will be, it won't be like the REF. It will be far better. It won't be so bureaucratic, which remains to be seen. So anyway, simplification was part of the drive. And if one wants to be a bit more cynical and look for more ideologically driven agendas in all of this, which I suppose is fair enough, the rhetoric around simplification dovetailed very nicely with other big imperatives in the system. The imperative of austerity, all of this discussion obviously leading up to a spending review where everyone was braced by the noises coming out of the Treasury and George Osborne for the need to make yet further significant cuts. And in a department where, unlike the world of biz under Vince Cable and David Willits, where you had ministers from different parties in the coalition who were broadly aligned in terms of their commitment to the university system, to the research base, their willingness to fight the corner for the research budget with the Treasury. You had in the new ministerial lineup, at the top, Sajid Javid, a Secretary of State who clearly is much more of an explicitly ideological Thatcherite and was making lots of noises about his not just sort of willingness but even enthusiasm to cut his own department more savagely than even the Treasury was asking. In fact, I mean, apparently that's how the negotiations played out. The offers that biz were making were actually rebuffed by the Treasury as too severe. This whole debate was further sort of fueled by the decision taken by Sajid Javid to call in McKinsey over the summer of last year, so 3 or 4 months before the spending review, to undertake their own kind of quick and, well, it was a 3-week exercise, a very sort of classic McKinsey consultancy sort of solution to something like this, to come in, look at all the bodies that biz funded, and to make recommendations for the future of the department and its constituent partner bodies. That gave rise to the so-called Biz 2020 plan, which has never been published. There have been various attempts by parliamentary select committees to get it to be issued. The best we have is this series of PowerPoints, which we, in fact, I edit a science policy blog on The Guardian, and we sort of leaked this stuff when it first emerged in September. But the headlines of the Biz 2020 plan are around delivering the sorts of cuts that are required through a reduction in the overall number of biz partner bodies, going from about 45 to about 23. And of course, those 45 include all of the 7 research councils, HEFCE, Innovate UK, I mean, all the bodies that fund and support the research system, as well as other bodies like UKTI, etc. So just have a halving in the number of bodies, irrespective of function, to reduce drastically the number of sites and locations, and we're now experiencing the knock-on effects of that in Sheffield. You'll have seen, I'm sure, the decision in the last few weeks to close the Biz office in Sheffield, which is its largest office outside London, actually has most of its higher education policy experts. That's going to be closed, and people working there are going to be offered the choice of redundancy or going and working in London. And it's hard to see, as several MPs from Sheffield have been pointing out in parliamentary questions and debates, quite how that model is going to save the government money, given the relative cost and house prices and everything else, London and Sheffield. But anyway, BIS 2020 was produced. And so at the moment this came out, this was several months before the Green Paper, it was fairly obvious to anyone looking at it, well, if they're really going to do this, then some of the research councils are going to have to disappear, because you can't cut 45 to 23 when 8 or 9 of those are research funders and not see some cuts in the number of bodies. So it meant that when we were preparing for things like the nurse review, a lot of people who follow these things were saying, well, nurse is going to have to merge the research councils. There's going to have to be a call to merge the research councils, because otherwise, how are they going to deliver what they've promised? At the same time, on the REF side of the dual support system, you had a lot of agitation from various additional actors beyond just poor, weary academics complaining about the REF, as we all want to do. Most notably, the Institute of Economic Affairs, well-known right-wing think tank, very close to Sajid Javid. He gave their annual lecture last year at their sort of big anniversary conference. They produced a report, again, around this same sort of time that the BIS 2020 stuff was going on, calling for the Research Excellence Framework to be axed, not for reasons of simplification or making our lives easier as academics, but because it was a waste of money. You know, this sort of unspecified £1.6 billion a year that was being funneled into universities should just be removed altogether. And so in the lead up to the spending review, many of us were worried that we would see, potentially the removal of the dual support system altogether, or a transfer of money from the QR, the quality-related portion that gets allocated to the REF, to the research councils. So these were all the sorts of things that were swirling around. Of course, as I say, going back to the spending review, when it all came out, set against these kind of options, it was a much more benign outcome than some people had feared. And of course, one shouldn't. I'm not a conspiracy theorist in pointing these things out. I mean, I don't overplay the power of the Institute of Economic Affairs. I worked for several years at the think tank Demos, so I'm fully aware both of the power and the limitations of think tanks. The IEA mostly are sort of slightly odd, swivel-eyed, elderly gentlemen. I used to, this is not the IEA, but there's another right-wing think tank called Civitas, and this is completely irrelevant to my talk, but it just makes me think of it. The Civitas involves people like Melanie Phillips and various other figures on the right, and we shared an office with them when I worked at Demos, just by Waterloo Station for several years, and it was all open plan. It was a very sort of late 90s, early 2000s kind of working, collaborative with sort of beanbags in the corner and stuff. And once a week, every Friday, Civitas would hold their weekly lunch, and they would bring into this sort of open plan, very Swedish style office space, a team of sort of butlers and women dressed in sort of frilly apron to sort of recreate the vestiges of a kind of Victorian boarding school dining experience. So it was very odd. Similar features are found in I'm sure the working environment of the IEA. Anyway, going back on topic, other things going on in the background of all of this. The role of the chief scientist, Mark Wolpert, more quiet of late in terms of public interventions. But if we go back to the last election, the end of 2014, the government had brought out a science and innovation strategy. It brought out a document just before Christmas in December of 2014, and that was very much the product of the work of Mark Wolpert. Most of it was written by Mark Wolpert, and it was well known that he too had serious concerns about the structure and efficacy of the Research Council system. There have been various efforts to change the way money was allocated. There'd been a big process of capital allocation, part of the fruits of which were, of course, the Royce Materials Institute, which is being built here in Manchester. Very big dollops of public money that were being spent, motivated by kind of high-level economic, political priorities, and somewhat bypassing the normal governance mechanisms that we would expect to see in the allocation of such funds. And, of course, this stuff created quite a fuss at the time. So lots of sort of things going on in the background. And then, as I say, the Green Paper lands. most of it is about teaching, as all of you will have seen if you've read it. The vast bulk of the document is devoted to the teaching side and to the debates about the TEF. Part 4 is on the research system. It's by far the thinnest part of the system, the thinnest part of the green paper, but it's no less radical than the rest of it in terms of the potential changes that it's hinting at, although it is somewhat opaque in what it says. And it's been very interesting seeing the responses to the green paper, which have all now come in. I don't know how many of you have seen this relatively new, been around for a couple of years, site called Wonky, which gathers a lot of interesting articles about university policy, research policy. But they collected, and still have on their site, a lot of the responses that came in from different organisations to the green paper. And I mean, in line with the green paper itself, most of the attention in those is devoted to the TEF and worries about the TEF. But there's also quite a lot of discussion on the research side and some very negative reactions to the proposals that are being made from some quite powerful voices in the system. One good example, to pick one at random, as it were, is Cambridge in its response, which is it's very polite, sort of very Cambridge, but sort of quietly devastating of everything that the government's proposing in respect of reforms both to teaching and research. That's worth a read if you're interested. It's also quite critical of what NERSE is proposing. So you've had a big pushback just this week. Monday, you saw the BIS Select Committee again coming out with some pretty tough questions about the TEF, sort of thresholds that they were asking to be met before it were implemented in even in its light touch way, let alone its full form. Going back to the NERSE review, for all the reasons I've said, this line that he was trying to tread between maintaining the system as we know it, but also responding to the kinds of concerns that were reflected in the McKinsey report, the kind of agenda from the department, a lot of people reading it felt it sort of fell between two stools. It was trying to do two things at once and sort of didn't really succeed in doing either. I wrote quite a lengthy commentary on the NERSE review, which is up on this wonky site called NERSE's Watery Prescription for Research, which I should say isn't just based on my own prejudices, but was based on conversations with quite a number of senior people in the system, people in BIS, people in the research councils, senior people in several universities, etc., most of whom were unwilling to go on record with their criticisms of the President of the Royal Society, who I should say I worked for several years. And I admire Paul greatly in lots of respects. He's a fantastic scientist, fantastic man. But I don't think this was a particularly good piece of public policy for the reasons that I spell out in this piece. And it left us still with lots of uncertainties because it didn't really tell us the answer. It sort of hedged things. Research UK is being proposed, but the Research Council is going to survive. But Research UK is going to be led by this sort of very powerful super scientist chief exec, somewhat mentally modelled on a kind of Paul Nurse template, the sort of Nobel laureate scientific university leader, who is going to oversee the system. She will become the single accounting officer in the new system. So instead of all 7 councils having a line in to government and a direct line of accountability and reporting, there'd be a single individual doing that, and then the other research councils would report to that individual. So all of these, and when you look at them in toto, you say, well, even if they're sort of saying this is still 7 research councils, it's going to have one accounting officer, it's going to have one chief executive to whom the others will report. At some point, if it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. It's a single body. And you could very easily see how it sort of slides into that in a succession of manoeuvres rather than one big bang in an effort, in a sense, to dissipate concern over this. And I think which I think is a shame, because it's not that, personally, I'm opposed in principle to a single research council. There are plenty of systems around the world that operate effectively with a single or dual system. One thinks of the US with the NSF and NIH. Sweden is another example. Lots of examples around the world. And again, one of the great failings of NERSC was that there was no effort to undertake any proper empirical inquiry into how one governs research systems around the world, what Britain could learn, none of that was in it. It was all very much, it was sort of Cartesian, I think as a Nobel laureate, therefore the research system will be. And it's, for people like me, again, who work in this field, it's frustrating to see several decades of work, far from perfect, I'd be the first to admit, but work that lots of people have done on these kinds of questions that was just not even featured. I mean, it was utterly invisible in this document. So, that's NERSC. To get to the nub of it, I just need to check the time. I talk for too long. What's known and what's unknown at the moment? These are the main points as I'd see it. We know that we have a ring-fenced budget, 4.7 billion, that it's ring-fenced in real terms, so it will go up to 5.1 by 2020-21. That's obviously good. The gap, though, between the flat and the real is being bridged not by a conventional line of investment into the research councils in the normal way, but by raiding the ODA, the DFID Overseas Development Budget, and creating a new Global Challenges Fund, which will be administered by the research councils, initially through RC UK, but obviously by RUK when that comes into existence, and will rise steadily over the spending review period. So in the first year, 16-17, there'll be 100 million spent through that, but then by the end of the period, there'll be 500 million being spent through that. So although it's a benign settlement, the proportion of money in the system that's coming through this route and is therefore more directed, more strategically prioritised, has to be in some demonstrable way connected to DFID priorities in order to comply with Treasury and OECD accounting rules. That proportion increases. And as I'll say in a minute, we don't know how this is going to be administered, the Global Challenges Fund. Because, of course, the research councils don't know how they are going to be operating 2-3 years from now because of the proposals over RUK. If it were just run in the normal, here's a new line of funding, let's put it through the system, and the research councils will have their usual tussle over how it gets spent, and there'll be joint programs. We sort of know, that model's far from perfect, but we sort of know how it works. Some have said that the size of this, bearing in mind by 2021 it will be double the size of ESRC, more than 5 times the size of the AHRC, it should actually be treated as a new separate research council within the new system. So there's a debate still running there. You've got a doubling, in addition to the Global Challenges Fund, you've also got a commitment to double the Newton Fund, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with, set up a couple of years ago to support targeted collaboration between the UK and emerging economies, not all economies, particular economies, particularly China, Brazil, India, but also some of the other rising economies in Latin America, other parts of Asia, etc. Capital investment will continue along the lines of increased investment that were promised before the last election, and of course that was making up for savage cuts in the capital line that we got in 2010. In 2010 the research line was protected, but the capital was cut initially by about 40%, and then very quickly government realised that wasn't going to work because you couldn't run the research system without capital investment, so they've redressed that and they're going to continue investing in that, which is good. Contrary to the kind of fears I was talking about over the summer, documents like the IEA's report, it was very clear in the Green Paper and from things that the Chancellor said at the spending review that the dual support system would survive. We would continue to have the research councils and the quality-related strand that's normally now administered through the REF, which is good. But HEFGI's dead, or HEFGI's dying. That was very clear in the Green Paper. And out of the ashes of HEFGI will be created this new body, the Office for Students. But Office for Students won't have responsibility for research. This is at least the argument of the Green Paper. I mean, whether this happens is a point of debate. But it's known that that's policy, as it were. one of the big pushbacks in responses to the Green Paper has been people saying, well, it needs to be an office for students and higher education. It needs to retain that more holistic, complete focus on the totality of the system, research, teaching together, which many of us feel is a danger in creating a sort of separate structure for the teaching side and that's very student-facing, and then a different structure for the research side. You lose the connective tissue between teaching and research, which HEFCE, for all its undoubted imperfections in areas, did at least provide. We know, because he devoted several sentences to it in his spending review speech in November, that the Chancellor has accepted the Nurse Review recommendations. Of course, many of us, in response to that, say, well, what does he think he's accepted? Because there's so many, ambiguities in Nurse's proposals. See what I mean? It sort of leaves open the kind of subsequent political interpretation that isn't entirely obvious from what's on the page. RC UK will transform to Research UK. I think that's clearly going to happen. There will be further consolidation of some functions in that new body and new powers, but the extent to which you get the full fat or the semi-skimmed version of RUK will depend more than anything else on whether we get an HE bill, which I'll talk about in a minute. Other things that are clear in the Green Paper, and it's said again in the Stern terms of reference, that the next REF will take place by 2021. So REF 2020 is dead, as I'm sure you're all aware. All of those consultancies that set themselves up, as ref2020.com, whatever, have had to buy new URLs. It will take place by 2021, so the interval's been increased by a year. We're told that that's a red line. And again, that's perfectly plausible unless you radically change the exercise, in which case you'll create some trouble. And Innovate UK has had its budget maintained in real terms, but there's now an argument running, and there's just been a very, very short consultation. It's like a 9-day consultation, which is a great way to have a consultation to which you don't want anyone to submit any comments, as to whether Innovate UK should be folded into Research UK or maintained as a sort of quasi-autonomous innovation agency. If you go for the full consolidated model, you're going to have Research UK with all of the 7 research councils, plus Innovate UK, plus the QR line that currently HEFCE runs, and administration of the REF. Becomes a very, very powerful body, and a single body that sits atop the entire research budget in this country, which some would say could be a good thing, because, as I say, we can have a debate about single or multiple organisations, but we haven't really had that kind of explicit debate about that issue. It's all been a sort of argument by proxy. The unknown, first and foremost, is both whether and when we will have a bill which is required to enact some of the more far-reaching reforms in the Green Paper. So the creation of the Office for Students, the move to a single accounting officer in the Research Council system. This stuff requires primary legislation. And of course we have a government with a slender majority. It has difficulty getting stuff through the Lords. There's a lot of science, pro-science people in the Lords. Added to which you've got all of the uncertainties of the EU referendum in terms of the destabilisation that would result to all parliamentary activity if there were a vote in favour of Brexit. There's quite a lot of uncertainties, but I mean, at the moment, I'd say it's probably 70-30 on that there will be a bill, that it will come forward in the Queen's speech, although the Queen's speech is also being delayed.
Sorry, quick clarification. So about the dual support funding system, so how long will it last? The research consoles on the one hand and the REF-based system.
Well, it will continue, but the administration of both strands of dual support would move under one body. So currently, obviously, the REF sits under HEFCE and the research councils are the research councils. Instead of them being separate to reflect the dual support, you'd have it all in one body. And one concern that prompts, which is also reflected in the response to the Green Paper, is, well, what's to prevent the QR budget being kind of raided for particular priorities that emerge over time? So, the research councils suddenly decide that artificially intelligent nanobots are, the future. We need an urgent UK artificially intelligent nanobot initiative. We should probably base it in Manchester. And it's going to need £800 million. Well, we haven't got we had to take it out of here. And so that's the worry. So a lot of people have said, well, there needs to be some kind of legislative protection for the QR line. And I mean, in a world where all the Research Council chiefs are equal, and then you've also got HEFGE over here with an equal voice in the system, there has to be a negotiation between them. In a world where you've got a single chief executive, albeit with a committee around him or her, and he or she is the only person who talks to government, plus if Nurse in his full form also proposed a ministerial committee, which would then sit above Research UK and tell Research UK what it thinks it should do, again, a worry for those who want to keep sort of political interference out of the system. You can quickly see how you get a much more centralised system. Yeah.
In your discussion so far, you seem to be discussing quite a lot of stakeholders, but you seem to be missing out the position of British industry. And the reason I raise this is when Willis was in power, he was very clear about the relevancy of British research. He found that his opinion was it wasn't that relevant. And he also found that British industry wasn't pulling its weight in terms of funding, that most of the funding was coming from government, and he couldn't see that continuing. Now, in coalition, he couldn't do much about it, but now that Javid is there, the Conservatives do seem to be sort of saying, well, listen, British industry, you need to sort of pull up your game and put more money into the system, and you can sort of see that happening with the minimum wage and stuff like that. So, isn't it really just a matter of time? Isn't this sort of more of a holding sort of show until actually British industry are sort of saying, listen guys, you're responsible. If you want to grow, if you want research, you've got to pay for it, fund it, and run it. Yeah?
No, that's a very good question, and you're right. And this has been obviously a persistent problem in the British system, that compared to the German research system, the US system, the proportion of the total research, I mean, we're talking here about I am focusing on the public funding side of the system. If we're talking about the totality of the innovation ecosystem, of course, the public slice is a small proportion of the totality, which even though industry needs to do more. Going back to Gordon Brown, the 10-year framework in 2004, the deal was, I as Chancellor am going to put double the amount of money in research over a 10-year period, and you, British industry and British business, need to match that investment, and through that we'll end up with a more innovative economy. And of course it didn't happen. I mean, not least, of course, it was 2004, 2007, we know what happened in terms of business and the economy. I think you're right, but I don't, and the minimum wage stuff is good. I've not detected in the sort of speeches Javid has been making thus far a particular push on the kind of innovation research side of business. So I mean, it's a slightly different argument. What should be done and I agree with your position, but I don't detect at the moment any big levers that are going to mean this is an interim, because suddenly a load of new money is going to come into the academic research system from partners in industry.
New money, the way I look at it is British industry will be sort of told, listen guys, you've got to start funding stuff, and are going to be sort of dragged. Because at the moment, for instance, in quite a lot of universities, people like Rolls-Royce, they actually subcontract most of their research.
Yeah.
Their own research departments now are minimal.
No, absolutely. I mean, the AMRC we have at Sheffield is a very good example of exactly that. You're quite right. I mean, I think it's. I mean, if I just maybe get through the rest, I mean, it's a sort of debate to have. What I would say, I mean, one thing we have seen under Javid and under the pure Conservative government is actually a backing away from the kind of active industrial strategy, industrial policy that would have led to the sort of new contract between public and private actors that you're. I mean,
there's been no contract. I'm going to say that they cut and say it's up to you.
Yeah, well, maybe, yeah. But I mean, there has. I mean, I suppose I don't detect a big push in terms of creating a climate in which that will happen. I mean, maybe it has to happen by default. I don't want to talk for much longer. Let me go through. I've got a few more slides, but so apologies. This is now straying almost into Fidel Castro territory. Let me try and wrap up. Things we don't know. Timing the bill. In the absence of a bill, how far can this go? All of this stuff that I'm describing, and that's also a kind of slightly grey area. So the research councils are, at the moment, I mean, they've been going through the difficult process that follows any spending review of arguing about the budgets that they all have under the headline figures. But when they get beyond that, how far can they then go in setting up the structures and making the tough decisions that will be required to create our UK in advance of legislation? Do they wait for a bill and then do it all when it's been legislated, or do they sort of do it in shadow and then it will be kind of sanctioned by legislation? That's a kind of interesting debate. How will the Global Challenges Fund operate? As I mentioned earlier, we don't fully know yet. Will it be a separate thing? Will it be spread across? And will that change at the point that our UK comes into being? Good question. In addition to global challenges, which is the 100 million, 200, 300, 400, 500 over the period, in the NERSE proposals, and the research councils have signed up to this, there's an additional proposal for a new interdisciplinary pot of money that would be top sliced from all the existing budgets and put in a separate pot, and that would be spent on other strategic priorities. We don't know how big that pot will be. It will be at least 3%, could be 5%. But it's important, this, because if you think about the totality of the budget, the headline on 25th of November was, from the Chancellor, I've protected science in real terms for the next 5 years. Budgets are going to go up. All that extra money is linked to the DFID rules, and then even the other budget is going to be tinkered around with because more money is going to be... So if you're sitting there thinking, well, this is good news for my response mode bid to ESRC that I was planning to put in 6 months' time, it's not, because the proportion of the system that's flexible in that way is going to continue to diminish, as it has done over the last 5 years, as we've all experienced in terms of success rates in response mode, which of course vary across council, and also in demand management requirements from the councils. I won't labour that point. I was just starting to say the ministerial committee, which was proposed by NERSE, seen by NERSE in his report as a way of bringing more political ownership into decisions about the future of the research system, but seen by many outside as a dangerous road to go down in terms of eroding the so-called Haldane principle, slightly mythologised principle as it is, that separates decisions about research funding from political decisions about the size of the research budget. The notion of Haldane is that government sets the size of the pie, as it were, and then we, as a community, through our councils, with obviously input from a few business people and everything else, decide how the pie gets spent. This would introduce a whole new level of political engagement, if one wants to put it benignly, or interference, if one wants to be more pejorative. Will QRF move to RUK? That's clearly the thrust of the proposals in the Green Paper, but it is one of the things that's under consultation. If they create not an office for students, but an office for students in higher education, you could still keep the REF in that new thing if it was altered from the proposals in the Green Paper. But on face value, if they don't move QR to the research councils, in a sense, going back to Joe Johnson's desire to simplify, he hasn't really simplified much. Relationship of UK to UK, as I say, that's under consultation. Future shape of the REF, role of metrics, what's happened to the impact agenda, the reduction of administrative burden, lots of uncertainty there, and my last few slides will be about that. And then, of course, finally hanging over all of this, as over so many areas of politics and life in general, is the specter of Brexit, which would have lots of consequences for our university system, as have been widely discussed. But for the research budget, although there's a debate about whether we continue to participate in the way that Switzerland does or whatever as an associated country, we currently, of course, enjoy a healthy chunk of Horizon 2020 money, and particularly we're very good at getting ERC, European Research Council grants, so there's a worry about that. This was just the other day in the Times Higher, saying that the bill, as I was saying there, is odds on. It seems to be moving in favour of there being a bill, but we wait to see the Queen's speech. Basically, it should be in the next Queen's speech. Okay, so have you got? Do you want me to say a little bit about metrics, and then I'll try and wrap up? Is that? And I know some people had to go too, so I will try not to go on too long. Just want to talk about the future of the REF now in specific terms. So there's going to be dual support. there's going to be a REF of sorts. It's going to happen by 2021. It might happen under RUK. It might happen under HEFG. Either way, it's going to have to start life under HEFG, because I should say, if there's going to be a bill, the earliest point at which these new bodies could be constituted would be the 1st of April 18. That's the anticipated timetable. So, get a bill in this year's Queen's Speech, go through the parliamentary process, and then the 1st of April you'd see, the lights being switched on, as it were, in a new organisation. On the future of the REF, there's been lots of discussion about this, and I've been myself involved in one part of that discussion, which is about whether the next REF should be more based on metrics than on the existing panel-based peer review system. In the existing system, as you'll be aware, panels can choose whether or not to use citation data as a resource, but the decisions are based primarily on judgment and discussion among the panels. Many people say, or some people say, the answer to the burden of the REF is to go to metrics, because then it could just all be done at the touch of a button. You wouldn't need panels, you wouldn't need... It would just, we'd just ask Elsevier to do it, and they'd run the numbers on Scopus and they'd give us the answer. And of course, Elsevier is one of the people telling government that this is a good way to do it, unsurprisingly. So we did this review, came out in July. It was initiated by government, but it was independent of government. And we published 3 documents: the main report, the blue one there, a literature review, and we did a detailed correlation analysis of REF14, the outcomes as we know them that came through the panel process, and what would have been the outcomes had we used a basket of 15 bibliometric and other quantitative indicators. Willits announced the review. These were the people involved. It was a good mix of natural scientists, social scientists, humanities, people involved in different bits of the funding system, university managers, etc. I won't go through everything we did. Suffice to say, it was a big and thorough undertaking. Unlike the nurse review, we tried to do some research, and we went out and about a lot. I spent a large part of the 2014 and the first part of 2015 doing things like this, coming around different universities in the UK, talking to people about the REF, about their experience of it, about how they felt about metrics, and trying to get a real sense of what this would mean. And then in addition, we ran the numbers, and we had 2 very serious bibliometricians in the group, and we did a lot of modelling and simulation of different outcomes. There was a lot of debate that this provoked, ranging from, as I say, people like Elsevier coming in very hard in favour of the use of metrics. This was a blog from David Colquhoun, who's a pharmacologist, fellow Royal Society, big campaigner against various forms of pseudoscience as he sees them, and he puts metrics up there with homeopathy and witchcraft as 3 of the great evils confronting contemporary science, etc. I won't go through all of this. Context for the review was, of course, the REF and what should happen with it, but not only the REF, and it wasn't a review about the REF, it was a review about metrics. It's important to say this if you haven't had a chance to look at it. And there are other areas in which the power and pressure of indicators are encroaching on our lives as academics and as research managers, not least our old friends' university rankings, which are not going to go away. So in a sense, and this is one of my arguments about metrics, that whatever you do with the REF as an exercise, you don't remove the need to kind of optimise and manage the system, because there's a lot of other audiences and contexts in which this process of optimisation is carrying out. Now, we may not like that that's the case, and that's a valid debate to have, but it currently is the case. And so, as I'll try and say before I end, I think in a way the REF has become a sort of scapegoat in a way for a set of discussions that we want to have as a community about types of management, about the role of different systems of management, but a lot of the problems aren't actually directly attributable to the exercise. It's to sort of rather deeper factors and forces at play in contemporary higher education system. Other factors, you've got the rise of alternative metrics, which is a really exciting area, new ways of measuring impact in particular, and we looked a lot at that in our review. And then you've had this pushback against inappropriate uses of indicators and metrics, which has been growing in volume and intensity over recent years as different academic communities and many publishers as well, and scholarly learned societies have said, this is going too far. There are now increasingly visible perverse consequences of the inappropriate use of particular indicators in the system. Journal impact factors perhaps being the indicator that attracts the greatest objection and the greatest debate. So DORA is one example of that, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment. And our report, I won't go through the recommendations because of time, I haven't got slides on them, but they're all in the report. But there were a lot of very detailed recommendations in the report about what we should do. But before and above that, we tried to set out a more conceptual framework for how we should take advantage of the possibilities and contribution of quantitative indicators in the system, which I'm fully in favour of. I mean, I'm not in any sense anti metrics in principle. I think that would be a somewhat absurd, illogical position to adopt. I mean, they're if you like, a technology like any other technology. It's all about how you use them and in what context and with what degree of care. So we put forward a framework for responsible metrics, saying that metrics need to be robust, of course, in terms of accuracy and scope, but also humble. You need to recognise that there are limitations as well as contributions of quantitative evaluation methods, and there always needs to be a role for judgment in the system as a check, as a balance, as a corrective against any of the problems that arise with data approaches. The data systems themselves need to be transparent so that those who are being evaluated can test and verify the results. We need to take particular account and pay particular attention to diversity in the system, diversity of discipline, and the very different ways in which different disciplinary and subdisciplinary cultures produce research and consume research, but also a plurality of researcher career paths. A lot of concern in our review about equality and diversity issues. If we go down a very narrow metric path, there's lots of solid evidence around the gendered nature of citation practices and other things that need to be taken into account. You can't just move to the system and pretend we don't know that stuff. And one of the reasons why the REF was so time-consuming in 2014 was that it did devote more care and attention to those factors, dealing with people with special circumstances of varying kinds, etc., all of which is very time-consuming because people are individual and that's messy and it's time-consuming, but it's important. And a database, Scopus, doesn't do that. Reflexivity, finally, that as good social scientists, those of you that are social scientists, natural scientists as well, we recognise the need to make systems of audit and assessment adaptable to the ways in which they get used, the incentives, good and bad, that they introduce into the system. Lots of discussion of the metric type, which LSE collected some there. When the green paper came out, we reconvened the metrics group because we were worried that they seemed to be minded, at least in the green paper, to ignore our recommendations. They did. To be fair, they did reference the metric tide, but it was in that slightly equivocal way that government documents can do, where they mention it and then they mention one of our recommendations that's entirely uncontentious and doesn't stand in any opposition to everything in the green paper, and ignore the sort of 22 points we made that would throw up concerns over some of the language around metrics that was in the green paper. The sort of thrust of the green paper, insofar as it talked about metrics, was broadly supported, not only in the REF, of course, but in the TEF. And you saw there, and obviously a lot of the debate about the TEF has been potential worries about the quantitative indicators that will be used in the TEF. That continues to be the subject of fierce debate, not least because the green paper weirdly said, well, which metrics, which indicators we use is a sort of technical detail on which there'll be a subsequent consultation. And of course, well, if you're going to have a metric-based system, then everything rests on which indicators you use in terms of how the system operates, what it incentivises, what it rewards, what it penalises. So, this is not a sort of technical detail. So So we've reconvened and we've sort of kept our hand in on this to some extent. There's been concern, there's been debate. This is something I wrote last month in the Times Higher, saying that there's lots of things we can do to improve the REF, and I'm certainly not saying don't change it at all. The headline's a little bit misleading, I didn't write the headline. But I am saying that switching to a purely metric-based REF is not the answer, for reasons I'll elaborate on before shutting up. There are, as per my earlier point, there are lots of other systems around the world grappling with the same questions, and I think it's important that Nick Stern, in his review, looks in detail and systematically at the lessons there are from other systems. But to sum up my concerns over a metric-based REF, and it's important I'm saying based here, so you're talking here about a system that would remove the peer review element altogether, which is the only way in which you can really reduce the cost and burden through metrics. I mean, some people say, well, can't you have the best of both worlds, bit of metrics, bit of peer review? And of course you could, and there's lots of, and in fact we advocated a sort of more hybrid economy of modes of assessment, if you like, in our report, but that doesn't doesn't make it quicker or simpler. So the concerns are coverage and robustness across different fields, especially arts, humanities, social sciences. With the REF as we know it from 2014, even if you could do the outputs by metrics, which you can't in a robust way, as my review showed, you certainly can't do impact. The range of impacts that are reflected in the 7,000 narrative case studies for REF 14 cannot be in any recognisable sense quantified at the moment. I mean, alt metrics are great and exciting, and I'm very excited by them myself, but they're not yet at a point of robustness or maturity that they could be used, certainly for the allocation of large, significant amounts of public funding in the way that the REF leads to allocation. As I've said, there are equality diversity considerations. And then a more subtle point, but an important one, I think the cost savings are exaggerated. I think the debate about the cost of the REF is largely wrong-headed. The headline figure from Hefke, which is quite a full cost accounting figure, was £250 million, which sounds like a lot, but taken as a proportion of the 10 billion that will then be allocated, it's not particularly high. It's a lot less than the equivalent cost on the Research Council side, if anyone calculated a full cost model, which no one has. The last available figures from the Research Councils for the cost of administering the system were issued in 2006, and even they only include the cost of the panels, not the cost in institutions of writing bids, reviewing bids, most of which never succeed, and of which ever-diminishing numbers are succeeding because of the other pressures in the funding system. So in a world where 92% of response mode proposals to the SRC fail, if we want to have a proper debate about costs of the research system, we need to put some cost on that, because the REF number puts a cost on all the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. So there's a debate that is often conducted in a rather, in my opinion, a rather ill-informed way. Even if you went with metrics, you would still see HEIs buying in then a whole new generation of analytic services to interpret, predict, analyse performance ahead of the... I think most of the money that's currently being spent will just be spent in different ways on services being offered by companies often beginning with the letter E and based in Amsterdam, and others, that would see this as a massive growth market, and indeed do see it as a big growth market. Timing is another issue. If there's going to be radical changes and we're going to have a REF by 2021, there's issues there. And finally, and I wrote something about this week, which I'll end on, the REF also has evolved to be about much more than allocation. So again, if we're going to have a debate about costs, benefits, burden, if we just see it as an allocation instrument, we're missing a lot of what the REF actually does in the system. Now, we can argue about what it does and why it does it and should it do it. Of course, that's entirely... But objectively, it does do a lot more than that now. It did do a lot more of that in 2014. And if we're going to go to a metrics-based system, it can't do as much as that. So there's a sort of issue there about purposes. Just on the subject stuff, on the spread across disciplines, this is actually a note I pulled together for Joe Johnson, my I met with him just before the Green Paper came out to try and sort of put a face on this in institutional terms. I mean, these numbers are in the metric type report, but I didn't cut them by institution. But just to show, I'm sorry I haven't got the numbers for here up here, but so this is in REF2021 the percentage of outputs that were put in that were not journal articles, so wouldn't feature in Scopus or Web of Science. So for, as you'd expect, for the very arts-based institutions, Royal Academy, University Arts, you're looking at 90%, 80% of everything they put in that wasn't a journal article. And you could say, well, does that really matter? I mean, they're only taking 300 grand of QR. It's a sort of slight rounding error in the system. We can cope. Where it gets more interesting is when you get down to... I should say, I'm not saying that, especially with the camera on me. But, someone could say that in response to that point. But when you get down to goldsmiths, 46% of everything they put in, and they're taking out 5.5 million a year. Really interestingly, 24% of everything Oxford put in, 21% of everything Cambridge put in, 20% of everything the LSE put in. It's about 24% of everything Sheffield put in. Isn't in Scopus. So if you went to a metric-based exercise, all of that stuff couldn't be submitted because there's just no metrics. And a lot of the recommendations in my report, which I haven't got time to go, are about, well, how do you create a research system in which we can actually create robust numbers for a lot more stuff progressively over time. And there's a lot we could talk about, which we haven't got time, ORCID numbers and DOIs and all sorts of stuff. There's lots of technical stuff in the metric tide about this. But you can't do it in the time cycle we're talking about for the next REF. As I say, savings are, I think, illusory. This is another similar piece by Jonathan Grant at King's. He did the analysis of all the impact case studies for HEFGE. So I'm just saying it's not just me saying this. So finally, I will stop. Sorry, I've gone on a bit longer than I said I would. This is something I wrote this week, in fact. Again, on this one key site that's there if you want to have a look. And excuse the title, time for a stern, hard look at the REF. And this is a sort of preemptive strike, as it were, by me on the Stern Review to just try and make sure that we do have... This one's not about metrics, and I've written a lot about metrics, and I've sent a lot of stuff about metrics to the Stern Review already. But this is about the question of purposes. Because, as I say, I think we need to have that debate and have it much more explicitly. And the kind of burden cost debate has become distorted by our failure to properly factor in the purposes question, because of course any cost-benefit equation will be ultimately determined by what we include in the frame, as it were, as benefits as well as costs. And this is a hard slide to read. I apologise, but I've just cut this off the screen of my new article. So I'm sorry if I look a bit crumpled. I've just come off a plane from Cape Town, so I'm somewhat surreally sitting in Hermanus on the Western Cape working, I should say, but writing about the REF this week and publishing this piece. But what I've said in that piece is that the REF, as we know it now, has 5 purposes. If you want to have a debate about allocation, which is where we end up swirling round and round so much of the time, that's one purpose. Stern Review terms of reference emphasise that as the primary purpose. But actually there are 3 purposes that are stated and have been stated as policy for a long time. They were the 3 purposes of REF20. Apologies if you can't read them. The first is allocation. The second is accountability, providing an accountability mechanism for spending £1.6 billion a year of taxpayer money over a 6-year period. The third purpose of the REF is benchmarking, allowing institutions, and obviously institutions at the departmental or UOA level, to benchmark performance against one another. Again, we can say that's good or ill, but that's definitely a function. And what I'm saying is there are those 3 purposes, but there are also 2 other purposes that have accrued to this exercise over time. Purpose 4 is influencing research culture and behaviour. So initially, going right back to early days of the REE, or certainly at least from the second cycle of the REE on, the main behavioural incentive was productivity. It was about getting people pumping more stuff out, and it has been successful. The reason we can now have ministers standing up and talking about the productivity of the UK research system is because of this. Again, we could argue about whether it's good or bad, but it certainly has been a major, major factor. In more recent cycles, it's been less about productivity, that's still in there. And obviously the last cycle, it was about introducing impact as a cultural, behavioural change to the system. And of course, we had, and to some extent still are having in the community, a debate about whether that's a good or a bad thing. But I think post-REF14, even many of those who were a bit sceptical about impact and impact case studies could see there was some value in this. And I think, normatively, politically as it were, there's a lot to be said in favour of encouraging more emphasis on impacts of various kinds. And I say impacts purposely, not just economic impact. Engagement with public policy, engagement with civil society, impacts in the system. And if we look at the next cycle, if you went just to metrics, you couldn't do more impact because you couldn't count it. And there are other things that the next cycle will try to incentivise. Open access through the HEFG open access requirements. More trivial but ultimately quite important things like the introduction of ORCID numbers, unique identifiers, all of these bits of the plumbing that will allow us to have a more intelligent assessment management system 10, 15 years down the line. And the final purpose, and this is the one that's the most controversial, is that, of course, the REF has become, in certainly most, if not all, universities, a de facto performance management system for research. It's the means through which research strategies are devised and set, discussions about impact are had, investment decisions are made, around staff, and again, we might not like that that's the case, but it is the case. So we need to have an honest discussion about this. And I mean, what I end on in my piece this week is just saying, I'm not saying this is a good or a bad thing. I'm not saying we can't improve the way we manage universities. I mean, I've myself advocated ways that metrics can be used in a more humane, transparent, democratic way to support the kind of university management culture that I, and I'm sure many of us in this room, would like to see. But we equally can't pretend we're going to roll back to a world in which there is no management at all, or there's no pressure and demand for accountability, or in which things like impact don't matter, because there are lots of reasons why those things matter and need to be, in some way, shape or form, managed. And in this piece, I sort of ended just using a personal example. I mean, I've just come in, having spent the last few years just back in a sort of pure research teaching role. I've come back in to Sheffield in one of these sort of grey area roles where I'm sort of half still doing normal academic things, and then also being more of a strategic manager of impact engagement policy through social science at Sheffield. So if I look at my diary, I said this in the piece, over the next 6-7 weeks, there are about 12 meetings in my diary that have REF in the title. And you might well say, well, this is insane, as I have described. This is an exercise that won't happen until 2021, for which we don't yet know the rules. What on earth is any institution doing holding dozens of meetings on this topic and wasting so much time on it? And I mean, it's a good question to ask. But, well, as I say in the article, actually, they have REF in the title, but these are meetings that need to happen anyway, which are badged as the REF, because the REF is the framework through which we think about these things. So we just are ending up in a confusion. People, as I said, are literally talking at cross purposes about cost burdens and the exercise. And I just think, we need to... because the reason I feel strongly about this is because, I see people reaching for metrics as an answer to the wrong question. They're focusing either only on purpose one, or they disagree with the other purposes, as it were, and think that rolling back to metrics will somehow make those things go away, which it won't. That would be a timetable if we did have REF21, which I won't go because I've gone on far too long. I'm sorry to labour the points, but I hope it's useful. The metric tide, if you're interested, is available free and online, but if you like things in covers with binding, Sage have also published it recently as a book with an updated introduction by me that says some of these things. Thank you.
Are you happy then to take questions?
Yeah. I'm sorry again, it was longer than I expected.
Do we have questions for James? I'm sure we do.
about impact. Do you have any feel for how, I'm speaking as an economist, how impact in terms of policy impact, maybe, whatever the next exercise is called, 2021? Is there any move towards assessing academic impact on policy development?
Well, that was a very big feature of REF2021. I mean, if you look at the analysis of the REF2021 case studies, impact on policy was actually the largest single category of impact. And I forget the exact percent. Well, if impact continues in the form it is, I mean, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why the impact debate, as we sort of knew it in the lead up to 2008 and a bit afterwards, has shifted, because obviously a lot of the concern around the introduction of the impact agenda was that it would be very narrowly focused on particular types of economic impact. Not that those are bad or shouldn't be encouraged through the system; they should. But I think actually impact, as it was addressed in REF2021, presents us with a reassuringly rich, diverse, complex picture of impact that includes a lot of policy activities. Across the Russell Group, at least, because they did put a percentage on it, 55% of all of the impact case studies from all disciplines had a impact on public policy. So it's a very, very big feature of the system. On the next REF, and again I talk about this in that piece I just published this week, some of you will be aware, there was going to be a consultation on the design of the next REF, which HEFCE had prepared, and it was ready to press go and release it, and that was stopped by BIS, by Joe Johnson and others, because of the Green Paper. They said, no, we pulled this back, we want to do the Green Paper. So it never sort of saw the light of day until 2-3 weeks ago, when there was a Freedom of Information request, and it was released. So it's now out there, and you can see the kinds of questions that were going to be asked, and they are in part on the impact side about whether the model of impact in 14 was a bit too linear, whether there was too much focus on the underpinning research, which ended up with a bit of confusion between outputs and impact, certainly in some panels, etc., etc. Some quite interesting questions being asked about the future of the impact component, whether the component should be increased to 25% from 20%, etc. So it gives you a hint, but of course, now all of those questions are on ice while we wait for Nick Stern and his panel to come up with a fresh set of questions and answers. And for me, the interesting thing with the Stern review is how much it will dive into that quite technical operational detail in the way that the HEFCE consultation did, or whether it will try and take a step back and actually ask some of these more fundamental questions, of the kind that I've been mentioning there at the end about purposes and the overall design of the system and incentives and management cultures in universities. I mean, personally, I think he'd be better to stay on that latter territory and then leave a lot of this more technical stuff to the consultation that we'll have to follow. My last slide I didn't use sets out how that would work. You'll have Stern, then there'll still need to be a consultation on the next REF post Stern, which will obviously have to take account and reflect Stern, or at least reflect the bits of Stern that the government agrees with, and then we'll be back in a process. So you could sort of see how it would still work for 21. But if you introduce very radical change, that whole timetable gets really pressured because of the need to do more piloting and testing, as we did in 2008-9 with the introduction of the REF as we know it.
Other questions?
I'm just interested in the 5 purposes of REF. And you've listed them: allocation, accountability, benchmarking, influencing the culture and performance management within HEIs. Of those 5, it seems to me that they're in order of priority, really, in terms of what they might be as a purpose. I would say that the first one, allocation, has been the primary concern of government in terms of its allocation of funding. And I would say that the others could all be done with different mechanisms, far easier than they might be done within this thing that we call REF. So I just wonder if that's an accepted premise, and you may say it isn't. Is it the case that allocation as the primary purpose, if I'm a government economist, I might sit there and just think to myself, well, the easiest thing, this sector is messing about, they just need to get these metrics in shape, and we just need to allocate the funds, and we know which 20 universities most of those funds are going to go to anyway, or which...
Yeah.
So...
Yeah, I mean, I've said this repeatedly, that if you want a purely algorithmic method for allocation, that's entirely achievable. And we could sit here now and probably, to within half a percentage point, predict the share of the next allocation QR that's going to go to the top 12, 15 universities in this country, and the far reduced share that will come to universities like this. One of the good things about the RE and the REF was, it did at least introduce the possibility, although it's not been full-blooded enough, in my view, for change and dynamism in the system. And for what it's worth, from my view, that's a good thing. A funding allocation mechanism that simply says Oxford has always had this much money and Oxford always should have this much money is not a particularly good system. So it should be based on performance in a quite granular sense. I think the accountability criteria is difficult as well, because simultaneously government wants to simplify and reduce costs, but also it's under enormous pressure, of course, to demonstrate the efficiency, effectiveness, responsibility with which public money is being allocated. And it would seem surprising to me that they would remove some kind of focus on accountability. The only other thing I'd say is, purpose 4, given that 1, 2 and 3 don't really account for the impact agenda effectively, which is one of the reasons that you need an additional purpose. Purpose 4, insofar as it pushed impact in the last cycle, that was directly included as a purpose by the Treasury. And if you read David Willett's own account, because he did a very nice interview for one of these sort of oral history type accounts of his time as a minister for the Institute for Government a few months ago. In those of you that recall the lead up to the 2010 spending review, when the coalition took over, so this was sort of the summer of 2010, we were expecting very serious cuts to the research system, 20-25%. Right at the last, in the last week, an additional £1 billion was found behind the Treasury sofa, as it were, and Willetts was very directly involved in those negotiations with the Treasury and George Osborne. And the deal, essentially, that was struck in return for that investment was the inclusion of the impact agenda in the REF, because the government wanted both to encourage impact and to find a better way to kind of capture it. So coming to this cycle, it would be somewhat perverse if you introduce a system that removed the ability to, unless you decide that the impact element has been such a spectacular flop that it doesn't deserve to be repeated. But that's not the general mood about the impact bit, either within government or, I think, within the research community.
Isn't impact, though, just a justification for allocation?
Well, it's a way of recognising and rewarding different types of activity that research contributes to. If you did just metric-based allocation, you're basically just saying the only thing that research really matters in research is getting your stuff cited by other academics, which obviously rocks the boat for many of us, but arguably is not the full totality of what university publicly funded research should try to achieve. Should try to produce in the world. So by making it 20%, it's enough, and also by making the number of case studies relative to full-time, FTE headcount, 10 to 1, as it were, you actually place quite a lot of weight on good impact. You're not saying everyone has to be doing impact or having impact, but you've got impact in the system.
It's government justifying efficiency, though, isn't it, for the funding?
Well, it's certainly helpful when it comes to then a spending review to be able to say, here are 7,000 examples of impact that were prepared earlier. And again, I think that's another reason why we should be grateful for it, because we need evidence like that in the system when it comes to spending review time. It's all grist to the mill. But impact. Their case studies. They are. Of course, it's an artificial construct of impact, but it's not at the same time unreal. It is pointing to things that do happen, albeit capturing them in imperfect ways through imperfect proxies of various kinds. But there's a debate. But this goes back with what the discussion we're having. What I'm saying is, let's have that debate about purposes, rather than having a sterile debate about a particular figure against a sort of impoverished account of what the exercise is trying to do. Because that's so much of the debate about, you pick up your average copy of the Times Higher, read some whinging article about the REF. Most of it is operating at that level, and it isn't, in my view, terribly illuminating.
You could make the argument that we've got so much good impact that we don't actually need other funding sources.
Well, yeah. That fortunately hasn't been a response as yet. But you're right. Yeah. There is a trivial version of that. Again, as some of you I'm sure will be aware, there's been a sort of kerfuffle, and I've written another piece about this in the Guardian the last couple of weeks, in recent, over the course of this month, about this anti-lobbying clause that the Cabinet Office has dreamt up, based, it should be said, on another Institute of Economic Affairs project, demonstrating my point about their influence. So the IEA produced a report a few months ago about the supposed problem of sock puppet lobbyists, primarily about charities that were funded with public funds who were then using a portion of that money to lobby for changes in government policy. And so this clause has been proposed that would make that illegal, as a kind of clause, sort of government changes of government procurement rules and regulations. But of course, taken at face value, that same clause would cover all research because it's also publicly funded, and it would essentially make illegal the use of any research council or hefty money to attempt to influence government policy, which would certainly be one way of killing the impact agenda. And I think, to be fair to the Cabinet Office, this is an accidental consequence of poorly drafted and poorly conceived policy, rather than a deliberate effort by Matt Hancock to sort of create a Soviet-style control mechanism for academics in not speaking out. But it's really problem. Something that's been wearing another. I chair the Campaign for Social Science, and I and the chair of the Campaign for Science Engineering wrote a letter to Matt Hancock about this, and we wrote a piece in the Guardian about it the other day. I think they are going to create some kind of exemption for research, but the mood could change on impact. It's not a given. I suppose what I'm trying to say about the REF is both on outputs and on impact. The REF is the way through which we create a sort of framework for doing this, but it's not the reason why we should do it. Of course, we should do good research because it's good research. We should try and have impact because we want to have impact. That there's a mechanism and a framework for trying to capture some of that and reward some of that, imperfectly, partially, of course, is a sort of necessity of bureaucracy and of. It's kind of an inevitable consequence in a system of this scale and complexity with this many people and this much money washing around that there needs to be a mechanism. So I'm sort of sceptical about those that, would sort of wish away all management, which is not, as I keep saying, to say that management can't be improved. And we're sitting here in a business school. I was at SPRU for several years in Sussex, inside the School of Business and Management there. I wish more of our attention in business and management was directed to trying to bring the better practices from the corporate world, from government, into the way we manage our own institutions. Because I don't think, by and large, we see many beacons of best practice in our own sector. But that, again, is not an intrinsic problem of the REF. The REF is merely the device through which imperfect management practices are sort of exercised. It's not the cause. So this is maybe I'm wrong in this, but this is my observations as someone who's sort of spent more time than I should looking and thinking about this.
Could you expand on your comparison of the results from the REF2014 with your metric system? Would it have been the same results?
I haven't got detailed slides with the figures, but I mean, we did a correlation exercise. We took all of the outputs that were included in REF14, and there were 191,400 and something outputs. I'm just sitting down. My legs are giving way after a night flight. So 191,000 and some outputs that were submitted into REF14 by 54,000 academics. In doing a correlation analysis, we were able to include 150,000 of those. The remaining 41,000 were dropped onto the floor immediately because there was no Scopus or Web of Science existence for them. They were books, monographs, in the cases of performance art, performances, digital things, the varying kinds of research output that don't yield a conventional indexed journal article. So the first important point is that you lose 40,000, and so the debate: how serious do you think that is, as a percentage of 191,000, is the first point at which you bring a kind of value judgment into that discussion. You could say, well, it's not the end of the world. And that's why I cut it by institution when I went to see Joe Johnson, because I wanted him to imagine 1 in 4 Oxford dons banging on his door at the top of 1 Victoria Street, complaining about being disenfranchised from the exercise, because that's a slightly, politically a slightly more worrying feature of the 40,000 being dropped than simply saying, it's a percentage of the total. But with the remainder, we then looked at all of those against 15 indicators. I mean, conventional bibliometric citation, normalized citation, etc., etc. And then we also looked at a few alt metrics as well. This is all in the correlation analysis report. And the correlation was closest in panel A subjects, life sciences, as you would expect. And then it progressively gets sort of weaker as you move out through B, C, social sciences, D, arts, humanities. But it's quite even under some of the sub-panels in A and B. It's still there are some quite significant divergences. And it's not to say that shows that the metrics are wrong and the REF was right. It just shows that they're different. And of course, I'm not idealising peer review. I'm not underestimating the problems of large-scale peer review exercises like the REF in terms of the amount of time people can spend on individual papers and all of the stuff that people argue about. But the results were different. And insofar as they're different, that's an important thing to bear in mind if you want to move from one approach to the other. How much difference it would have in terms of purpose 1, probably not very much. Percentage here, percentage there. It wouldn't suddenly mean Manchester Metropolitan is going to get Oxford's share of the money, or vice versa, whatever. But as you go down, it starts, it doesn't change that much. The benchmarking issue, it changes because, of course, you can't do the subject departmental level benchmarking. So, it would be a different result. It goes back to my objections to a metric-based system as to why that's a problem. But it's not only a problem because the numbers aren't robust. But, let's also be realistic. The numbers aren't robust. I mean, you're simply moving the problem to another place. I mean, I'm not a bibliometrician, so I obviously took a lot of counsel from people who were in doing this. But when you talk to bibliometricians, a couple of weeks ago I was over in Dublin talking to a really fascinating woman who works in the library there and has been taught. They don't have a REF in the Irish system, but for various other reasons in the university and in the national system, she's basically cross-referencing what's in Scopus and Web of Science with what their academics have actually produced. And the amount of errors and omissions and duplications and problems that, when you get down to that level of the system, I mean, they're by no means perfect, these systems. So they do require investment, and they need to be treated with care when used as the sole criterion under which one allocates money. That's really all that I'm saying. It's not that I'm anti the use of metrics. I mean, I've been working in research policy. I use bibliometrics a lot in various ways in my own work, but I don't. They have their limitations, and so a lot of this is an argument. I mean, actually, this is the thing that links both sides of my talk. If you want to put a single frame around it, it's really a defence of diversity. Why do some of these changes in the research funding system worry me? They worry me because there aren't many iron laws in research policy, but one of the things we do know from a very large quantity of empirical work across a very large number of different systems is that funding systems for research and indeed for innovation that have a diverse set of routes to funding in general perform better, because it's that diversity of routes that encourages dynamism, entrepreneurialism, disruptive change of varying kinds as new entrants can come in, and you don't create these large sort of hegemons of very sort of old sort of style. I mean, you see it still in the Chinese funding, the country I spend a lot of time. It is changing even there, but the sort of way in which funding works in the Chinese system, where it's all very it's all sort of much more planned and controlled through particular favoured institutions. So diversity of routes is really important, and the same here for assessment. It's not that metrics are intrinsically bad, but that we need a diversity of ways of assessing, tools, indicators, and quantitative indicators with other more qualitative modes of judgment and assessment in order to produce the kind of rounded assessment that underpins a culture of high quality, high impact research. It's as simple as that. And I mean, take this down a few levels from a national allocation exercise to the REF to something like criteria for hiring and promotion and all the other elements of the HR system in universities. I mean, that's again where we see very clearly the dangers of an excessive weighting and excessive reliance on a few narrow indicators at the expense of a more rounded assessment of someone's contribution and worth. And a lot of perverse behaviours that result from the perception of a more monofocal approach to what makes a good academic, what does a good academic career look like, what sort of journals do you need to publish in, what kind of impact factor do they need to have. I hate it. I mean, even, sitting now in a sort of low-level management job, the number of things I'm reviewing and people keep sending me with the journal impact factor of their job. I have absolutely no interest. If I want to read their papers, I'll read their papers. But, of course, we need shortcuts, and part of this, again, is down to shortage of time in the system and lots of other factors, but we really do need to get real about the inappropriateness of using particular indicators in particular contexts. And that is the biggest example, use of GIFs, journal impact factors, as a proxy for quality at the level of individual papers and individual researchers. It's deeply inappropriate. It's statistically illiterate, and it's toxic in terms of the kind of perverse incentives it introduces into the research system. We know this, we all know this, even though we all perpetuate it and we're all culpable in it. And at some point we need to stop, because it's driving science and research in a very, very dangerous direction. Sorry to get heated.
Any others? Right, well that is absolutely fantastic. Thank you, James. We'd like to extend our thanks to you for fascinating and inspiring.
Thank you.